If you're new here, welcome to Boring History for Sleep, where the quietest corners of history unfold slowly, gently, and without urgency. Tonight's story is one of ink, silence, and the invisible cost of beauty. Before we begin, take a moment. What time is it where you are? Are you in bed, on a long drive, or just lying quietly with your thoughts? Let us know in the comments. We read every one. And if these slow, forgotten histories help you rest, please consider subscribing. It tells us to keep going, quietly, patiently, one story at a time. Now, settle in. Let's return to a marble mausoleum where grief was written in stone. Not to be read, but to be remembered. Asterisk, it was not yet light when the bell rang. Not a holy bell. Not the kind of ringing meant for worship or reflection. This one was made of solid bronze, hoisted high by two wooden beams, and it echoed across the Yamuna River like a call to arms. If your hands weren't already white with dust by the time the sun hit the eastern scaffolding of the Taj, you were already late. And so he rose, the stonemason, the one whose name no one remembered because he wasn't important, but because so many like him were never meant to be remembered. Names slowed things down. Names brought attention. In this world of domes and precision, you were only a number, and only the marble bore your legacy. He was assigned to the southern colonnade, working under a foreman who never once raised his voice, but who could silence an entire team of 50 men with a glance. Their job was not to lay stone that had already been done. Their task was far more delicate, to carve lines so straight they seemed like they had been cut by the divine. Not by chisel and muscle, but the stone they were working with that day had arrived cracked. The stone had traveled weeks across dry riverbeds, dragged by bullocks, whose ribs you could count from 50 paces. It was a piece of Makrana marble, creamy white, veined like the sky at dawn. This particular slab was meant for a support base that no one would see. Still, the architect insisted it had to be perfect. If the base wasn't perfect, how could the whole stand proudly above it? So the foreman called over the stonemason, the one with the quiet hands and the careful eyes. He had smoothed marble in the dead of night when it was too cold for others to hold their tools. He had used goat leather soaked in oil to polish corners. He had once shaped a tulip so fine into the arch of a window that the emperor himself paused before it for a full minute. They said he had fingers that could whisper to stone. That morning, he was told to fix the slab. He did not question. He did not ask how long it would take. He knew this would not be a single-day job. Fixing a cracked stone was not like patching cloth. It had to be reborn, chiseled inward, then reshaped with a new edge. It was a form of controlled destruction. One mistake, and the entire load had to be recut or replaced, paid for by the worker. That was one of the many rules whispered between the workers, never written. Your error cost the project money. It cost you more than just wages. Some gave up their bonuses. Some gave up their daughters in marriage to the supplier's son. Some were forced to work without food until they made up the loss. And some simply disappeared. The stonemason did not think of these things. He thought only of the crack. It was jagged, but not deep. A key, it could be salvaged. He placed the slab on a sanded wooden platform, cushioning its edges with braided jute. He took out his tools, most of which had been handed to him by his father, who had also carved stones for graves and gateways. That was how it worked in those days. You were born into the trade, same as a calf was born into pulling carts. You did not wake up one day and decide to shape the Taj Mahal. The Taj Mahal chose you by proximity. You lived near Agra and could lift more than your body weight. You were considered. If you had a family member already inside the site's hierarchy, even better. But the stonemason had no family left. His father had died under falling scaffolding in the 3rd year of construction. His mother had vanished into the grain markets. He lived alone in a dormitory for laborers, a long mud structure lined with straw pallets and leather sacks stuffed with millet. He returned to the dormitory only to sleep and eat. There was no laughter in that place, only tired eyes, swollen fingers, and backs that cracked like old roofs every time they bent over to untie their sandals. No one spoke of the Taj with wonder. They spoke of it like it was a beast, something beautiful but hungry, something that could crush you and keep shining without a scratch. That day, a stonemason began carving the edge. He worked in slow lines, smoothing the crack into something purposeful. He had a technique he called the invisible frame, a method of shaving both sides of a fault until it formed an edge so fine it could disappear under polish. But that required time, and the foreman was impatient. Around midday, the foreman returned. He squatted beside the slab, not saying a word. He only watched. Then he stood and said, "If this isn't done by sunset, we'll move to a new piece." That meant the stonemason would be marked. Marked for wasting time. Marked for incompetence. Marked for not being enough. He worked faster by late afternoon. He was sweating not from the sun. It was not a particularly hot day, but from the pressure of precision. The line was nearly perfect, but the tools had dulled, and he dared not stop to sharpen them. Each stroke was a gamble. Then it happened. A single stroke too hard. A chip not large, but unmistakable split off the underside of the slab. The crack, once hidden, had spread further inward than he had calculated. His chisel had followed it, and now the base was unbalanced. The stonemason sat still. He did not curse. He did not cry out. He simply placed his tool down and looked at the line. Then he picked up the broken chip, held it in his palm, and walked to the edge of the construction yard. There was a ditch, there where rejected stones were thrown, but he did not drop the piece. He placed it carefully, almost reverently, like it had been part of something sacred. That night, he did not return to the dormitory. He was not seen again at the southern colonnade. His name was not called during roll, but the next morning, someone else stood at the same slab, carving again. The old tools were gone. A new set had appeared in their place, and no one asked why. Asterisk, by the time the sun rose the next morning, the Taj Mahal had already begun humming again, not in sound, but in movement. There were no trumpets, no announcements. It's dust in the air, the thump of wooden mallets, the scrape of chisel on stone, and the almost imperceptible rhythm of hundreds of men breathing at once, in unison, as if bound by a single command. They never heard out loud, and there he stood, a new mason, younger, shoulders not yet hardened, eyes still wide from sleep. No one knew his name either. No one asked. He had been brought in the night before, perhaps from one of the overflow dormitories where reserve laborers slept on rotas, waiting to replace those who fell ill or broke a tool or disappeared. He was told only this: finish what the other man left. The broken slab had been set aside, but the replacement was identical in size, cut from the same vein of marble, as if history had simply rewound and was playing the same, seen again with a new actor. But something had changed. The new stonemason had noticed it first. The tools, they were older than his. The metal was dull, the wooden handles worn smooth like river pebbles. Someone had cleaned them thoroughly. Not a trace of dust, not a hint of rust, as if they had been handed down by a father who wanted his son to make fewer mistakes. He touched the chisel, then the mallet. Something about them felt strange, not haunted, exactly, but personal, as if they still remembered the weight of the hands that had held them the day before. The young mason said nothing. He had been taught not to speak much, especially during his first week. He bent over the marble and began to work. Meanwhile, rumors drifted like warm air across the workers' quarters. They said the first stonemason had been sent away punished for ruining the slab. Tay said he had asked too many questions, that he had fallen ill. he had tried to run away, that he had been taken to a special room deep within the foundations of the Taj, never came back. Others said nothing at all, because silence was its own kind of currency in that place, in the emperor's court. Even rumors about the Taj were considered delicate. Shah Jahan had given orders from the very beginning. The building must rise like a prayer. That meant no mistakes, no delays, and certainly no drama. The workers were tools, not storytellers. But there was one person who remembered the stonemason. The foreman, not because he liked him, but because of the work. The line he had begun carving the invisible frame. Some of the men began calling. It was unlike anything they had seen. It was so smooth, so quiet in its angle, that when you ran your hand over it, you could not feel where the stone began or ended. It melted under your fingers like water. And though the slab had cracked, that curve remained. The foreman kept the broken stone near his tent, not out of sentiment, but as a reminder, perhaps, of failure, or perhaps of something that could not be replicated. The young stonemason had tried, but his hands weren't ready by the end of the second day. He had chipped 2 corners. On the third, he carved too deeply. On the fourth, the slab had to be scrapped again. The architect passed by during inspection and made a small gesture to the foreman. 2 fingers flicked toward the sky. Replace him. So they did. Another man came. One older, broader, less careful, but faster. His job was not to recreate the invisible frame. His job was to finish the work, get the line in place. Let the polishers deal with the rest. The dome needed to be built. Columns needed to rise. There was no time for artistry, and so the line was finished, but not like before. It was good, smooth, sharp, correct, but it did not disappear under your fingers. It stayed tangible, real, and maybe that was what made the difference, because months later, when the Taj's upper floor was unveiled to the royal supervisors, they paused at that very base. They noted the join line, elegant, but not ethereal, acceptable, but not magical. The architect said nothing. The foreman said nothing, but in his tent. Late at night, the foreman unwrapped the broken slab. He traced the edge, the one carved by the vanished mason, and he wondered, not for the first time, whether perfection had cost too much. You see, no one ever officially logged the stonemason's departure. His name was never on a pay list. He had never taken a day off, never complained, never demanded extra rations. He was, in every practical sense, invisible till he was gone. But the tools, those tools he had left behind, remained in circulation. Not because they were good, but because no one dared throw them away. Some said they cut cleaner than new ones. Others said they dulled too quickly, but the truth was simpler. Every man who used them knew that someone else had held them before and been erased for trying to make something too perfect. Even in the emperor's grand vision, even beneath the ivory dome that would one day become a symbol of eternal love, there was no room for a mason who slowed down the build, even if his lines could make stone vanish. And perhaps that is why, on the eastern wall of the Taj Mahal, beneath the sixth arch, behind a carved window lattice, no one looks through anymore. If you run your hand low along the sandstone edge, you might still feel a line that disappears midair, as if the stone were inhaling quietly, and no one knows how it got there, just that it's older than the rest, and that no one has been able to carve anything like it since years passed. Not quickly, not slowly, just the way years do when the air is filled with dust. And every sunrise means lifting something heavy, and every sunset means trying to remember where you last placed your hands. The Taj Mahal continued to rise, its dome swelling like a pregnant moon above the Yamuna. Minaret stretched like fingers toward the heavens, each block of marble laid in place not just by labor, but by quiet obedience. And somewhere inside the bowels of the structure, buried beneath layers of planning, perfection, and politics, the memory of the vanished stonemason settled, like silt on a river bedtime, but not quite forgotten. They called him the one who carved air. No one knew his name. Not really. A few of the older workers claimed they remembered his face. One said he always carried a folded piece of cotton cloth in his back pocket to clean the dust from his fingers. Another remembered that he never laughed. Or maybe he just laughed softly, like someone who was afraid of being noticed for the wrong reason. But none of them had a name to attach to these fragments. And in the Taj Mahal, names mattered less than marks. There were marks everywhere, teeny ones carved discreetly into corners and under slabs. Symbol here, a shape there. Creed codes left by workers so they could claim their earnings. It was an old system. 4 payroll lists were kept in ink. Men marked their stone, and the foreman tallied their work with his eyes. A curve, a notch, a flick in the corner of a floral motif. One afternoon, nearly 3 years after the southern colonnade had been finished, a new inspector was brought in from Lahore sent by the imperial court to audit progress and ensure that materials were not being stolen or substituted. He was methodical. He carried parchment thicker than his own wrists and wore gloves even in the heat. He moved from section to section, tapping stone, measuring angles, noting down the number of workers on each shift, and inspecting each signature carved beneath the scaffolds. Then he reached the 6th arch of the eastern wall, and he stopped, because here, beneath the quiet window, where shadows moved more slowly than the rest of the building, there was a panel, remarkable at first, but with something strange along its base. A line, so soft it could have been a trick of light, so seamless it felt like the stone was breathing. He crouched, ran his fingers along the curve. Then again, slower. He called for the foreman. The foreman came, older now, slower too, and listened silently as the inspector asked, "Who carved this?" The foreman didn't answer, not because he didn't know, but because it was better not to speak of things that weren't officially recorded. So he simply said, "It was done early in the project." By whom? Wasn't logged. Then why is it still here? Foreman was quiet for a long time. Finally, he replied, "Because no one else could replicate it, and because the architect said to leave it." That was not entirely true. The architect had noticed the line years ago and stared at it for a long time without speaking. When asked if it should be removed, he simply said, "It's already part of the structure. Let it be." Never mentioned it again. The inspector, meanwhile, noted the panel, sketched the line, tempted to list it in his records, but couldn't classify it. There was no corresponding name, no official code, no bill of payment, and so he wrote, "Unidentified detailing. Origin unknown, possibly decorative." But there were whispers again. The laborers began talking. Some said the stone was cursed, that anyone who touched it for too long would lose their sense of time. Others said it had been carved by someone who had made a deal with the divine, that the stone itself had agreed to shapeshift. A few simply said that whoever made that line had done so in a moment of such silence that even the emperor's breath wouldn't have dared to erupt. None of this mattered to the court. What mattered was the marble dot. The supply was dwindling. Makrana quarries were running dry. Transport costs were rising. Workers were aging. Some had died in accidents, others from exhaustion. The Taj Mahal was nearing completion, and the push to finish intensified. That's when the foreman made a quiet visit to the storage tent out there. Beneath dozens of crates, he found a panel, the broken slab, the one the first stonemason had cracked. All those years ago, he had never discarded it, but couldn't bring himself to. Something about that mistake had always felt sacred. He unwrapped it again. The line was still there, and more than that, the break had settled. Time had dried it, smoothed it, weathered it into something that no longer felt like failure. It had become part of the stone. He ordered the slab to be installed not at the base of a dome or the center of a column, but in one of the hidden corridors leading toward the internal chambers, a place few would walk, fewer would look. When the workers questioned him, he said, "It's good enough." But deep down, he believed it was the best piece they'd ever carved. And so the broken slab was laid into the floor, face up. Even now, if you were to walk that corridor, which is rarely opened to tourists, you would find a single square of stone smoother than any other, with a faint vein that curves like a whisper and vanishes under your palm. It is unnamed, unlabeled, and somehow more permanent than the emperor's own tomb, because sometimes what's forgotten lasts longer than what's remembered, and because somewhere beneath that marble, buried in dust and silence, is the ghost of a stonemason who gave up everything just to make the stone disappear. Asterisk. Husk. He may have stood before the Taj Mahal if not in person, then at least in a photograph, and marveled at its silence, its stillness. But very few people ever think about how it got there, not just why it was built or who it was for, but how it physically came to be. Because this was not a structure born of local stone and nearby trees. This was a monument carved from the earth hundreds of miles away, its parts shaped in far-off quarries, its spine built from red sandstone, its face layered with Makrana marble, its skeleton reinforced with timber, copper, bricks, and lime. And yet, what's most extraordinary is this. Not a single cartwheel was used to bring the largest stones into Agra. Not because wheels hadn't been invented. Of course, they had. Carts and chariots and timber sleds were common, but the roads, muddy in summer and cracked in winter, could not bear the weight. The slabs needed for the base of the Taj weighed as much as 40 tons. No wheel could survive the strain, and so they looked elsewhere, to water, to rivers, to mud. Asterisk. The Yamuna River was the lifeline of the Taj, long before the monument was even imagined. We curved gently beside the construction site, like a servant, waiting in silence. But what most visitors never realize is that for more than a decade before the first stone was laid in Agra, that river had already been working upstream. Asterisk. In Rajasthan, hundreds of miles to the southwest, in the dry, sun-bleached town of Makrana, stone was being cut. Not by machines, by hand. Long metal picks, wooden mallets, rows of men sweating into linen while they sliced giant blocks from the mud. Womb of the hills. The Makrana marble was special, dense, non-porous, white, but not blinding. It did not yellow with age, did not crumble. It whispered rather than shouted, and it was heavy, too heavy to roll. So the builders of the Tajanda, the command of imperial engineers, designed a system as patient as it was brutal. Each slab was to be dragged, slowly, by animals and men, to the nearest point where river tributaries could carry it further. But the river, in many places, was too shallow for full-size boats, and so they created floating sledges rafts made of thick timber lashed with coy ropes, topped with wet mud to cushion the slabs. These rafts were pulled not by engines, of course, but by ropes and poles and sheer human will. A team of 20 men might spend days guiding a single raft down a bend. The journey from Makrana to Agra could take 4 months. 4 months for one stone, and there were over 1,000 slabs required for the main platform alone. One of the forgotten names in this story is a man named Yusuf Khan, logistics overseer stationed at the halfway point near Etawah Stretch, where the river narrowed and currents turned sharp. Yusuf never laid a single stone, never shaped a single petal into marble. Ati is believed to have saved over 300 shipments from disaster. How? By predicting the weather, not with charts or forecasts, but with silence. He would listen to the river at dusk, placing his ear against the wooden dock, sensing the pressure in the current. If the water shifted to suddenly between 2 days, he would delay departure. His orders cost time, and time, in the emperor's eyes, was treason. But every raft that waited on Yusuf's command reached Agra intact. The ones that ignored him, half of them cracked, some flipped, and once a raft carrying 20 tons of marble sank just outside Doper, swallowed into a muddy stretch of river so deep no diver could recover it. The emperor was not informed. Instead, a new block was cut. Silence was preserved to manage all of this: the cutting, the floating, the dragging. The pulling required not just strength, but systems. So, small villages along the route were converted into supply hubs. Each was responsible for one part of the journey. One would maintain the coir ropes. Another sharpened the iron hooks. Another was tasked with feeding the oxen who carried the stones the last few miles inland. And somewhere in every village, someone was counting, not money, not wages, but days, because the marble had to arrive warm, not hot, not cold, but just warm enough from the sun to make it pliable under polishing. If it sat too long in shade, the dust from the journey hardened on its surface, embedding small particles that ruined the finish. Too long in the heat, and the edges would crack on impact. So men counted days with a discipline that rivaled the court's own scribes. And when the marble arrived in Agra, it was not greeted with fanfare. There were no ceremonies. Only men with wet cloths, ready to wipe the journey off the stone. They started at dawn and didn't stop until each slab glowed. Then, the stone was lifted without cranes, without pulleys. They built long, gradual mud ramps. Some said the ramps stretched for 5 kilometers to reach the upper dome. Others say that's an exaggeration, but what is certain is that elephants were brought in not to carry the stones, but to drag them up inch by inch across days. Sometimes the elephants collapsed and were replaced. No time to wait for recovery. The emperor had ordered a monument to grief, and grief, apparently, could not be delayed. But let us return for a moment to the river, because what no blueprint ever showed, what no historian ever fully captured, is the quiet terror that came with floating a 40-ton slab on water that could shift without warning. There were no guarantees, no insurance. The raft cracked, the slab was lost. If the rope snapped, the stone drifted. If the currents surged, everything overturned. Men tied prayers to their belts. Some refused to look down. One story speaks of a man named Abdul Rahim, a rope handler, who once spent 6 hours standing ankle-deep in freezing water, holding a drifting raft steady with his bare hands, while others scrambled to reinforce the banks. When asked later why he didn't let go, he simply said, "Because if I did, it would take another year to cut a slab that size." That was the measure of sacrifice. Not fame, not gold, just the avoidance of delay. By the time the final raft reached Agra, nearly 10 years had passed since the first stone was cut in Makrana. Most of the men who had started the work were no longer part of it. Some had died. Others had moved on to different cities, different projects. But their labor was frozen in white, embedded in a structure that millions would one day admire, without knowing what it cost to deliver a single block of marble from the quarry to the river, to the platform, to the dome. And even now, the Yamuna drifts quietly past the Taj. No plaque honors the river, no inscription marks the path, but without it, Taj Mahal would still be an idea, a monument, not a memory, just a dream. Asterisk. They weren't on the payroll, not officially. The ledgers kept by the court's treasury show the names of architects, stonecutters, engravers, guards, and water carriers. There are records of cooks and sweepers and lime mix specialists, but not of the rope makers, and certainly not of the rope holders, the men who walked for days on either side of the river rafts, gripping the lead ropes so tightly that their palms grew permanent ridges like the bark of old trees. They were called kamashhath, or quiet hands, and without them, the marble would never have moved. Their work began far from the stone itself, in coconut groves, where husks were boiled, beaten, and separated into coarse fibers. The women and children worked the spinning wheels, dipping their fingers into oil to prevent burns, weaving fibers into strands, strands into lines, and lines into long coils of rope thick enough to hold the weight of gods. Most never saw the Taj Mahal. Most didn't even know what it looked like. They just knew they were spinning for the monument. That's what they called it. Not a name, just a shape. An idea that hovered over their labor like a shadow cast from afar. Once a coil was ready, it would be boiled again, then rubbed with clarified butter to soften it. The rope had to be strong, but not stiff, flexible, but not slick. If it snapped, the stone could slide into the river. If it stretched, it could destabilize the balance of the raft. Everything depended on that delicate tension between pull and resistance, between strength and give. One man who understood this tension intimately was Lacan, a veteran rope holder stationed between Allahabad and Kanpur, where river currents curved with unexpected sharpness. He had held ropes for over 12 years. Not once had a raft, under his care, capsized. He walked barefoot, always, because he believed feeling the ground beneath him kept his pace in sync with the stone. He never shouted, never laughed, and never took food until the raft was moored at night. One evening, crossing a particularly stubborn stretch where silt banks narrowed the passage to half its normal width, Lacan felt the rope jerk suddenly. A log had drifted into the path. It struck the side of the raft, pushing it off balance. The stone tilted. The raft leaned. Lacan did not pull. He released for 2 full seconds. He let the rope go slack, and then just before the raft could tip, he tugged again, slowly, in rhythm with the current, realigning the slab's center of gravity. The raft glided forward. Everyone else on the team thought it had been luck, but those who had worked with Lacan long enough knew. He listened to water the way a stonemason listened to marble. That kind of listening could not be taught. It had to be lived. Yet, for all this years of experience, decades of silence never earned more than a few lengths of rope at the end of each season. Not money, not even food. Just rope. Rope he could use to make his own repairs, or trade for a bag of rice, or leave to his sons. His sons, either way, did not take up the rope. They left for Delhi. One became a rice broker. The other worked in a calligraphy shop. When asked why they didn't follow in their father's footsteps, one replied, because no one remembers the rope holders. And he was right. Even among those who cataloged the Taj's construction, who marveled at the calligraphy and geometry, who named the architects and craftsmen in long poetic verses, no one thought to name the people who made the marble move. No. One wrote about how, at every bend in the river, there was a team of silent men too, on each bank walking in step with a floating stone, gripping ropes for hours, days, weeks, until their palms turned purple and their fingers bent sideways from strain. No one recorded the way they slept on sand, their ropes coiled beside them like sleeping pets, or how they walked with one hand behind their backs, always protecting the pulling fingers from accidental injury, or how they grew to know each section of the river by sound, not sight. The Kamashhath had no temples built for them, no verses inscribed, but every slab of marble at the Taj was a silent tribute to them, because for every stone that gleams in the sunlight today, someone once carried the burden of it across an unforgiving river, asking for no recognition except the hope that the rope wouldn't break. And even then, the payment was often nothing more than another coil, Some of them used their leftover rope to tie roofs over their sleeping quarters. Some used it to bind their firewood. Others buried it, believing that the rope had absorbed the weight of a sacred thing and must return to the earth. In one rare account, an imperial guard noted that some rope holders began refusing payment altogether, saying that no matter how strong the fiber, it could not hold memory, that it would fray eventually. That forgetting was part of the job. And so, rope by rope, stone by stone, the Taj Mahal inched toward completion, not on the backs of elephants or the wheels of carts, but on the strained fingers of invisible men. You may never see them, but if you walk along the river, and the wind is right, and the banks are quiet, you might still feel the pull of something long forgotten, the gentle sway of stone, floating once again on the water, by the end of the 11th year of construction. The stone stopped moving, not because the work was done, far from it, but because the last shipment had finally arrived. The final raft, smaller than most, came floating down the Yamuna on a day so still that the river barely rippled. No one spoke as it approached, not the guards, not the rope holders, not even the children who had gathered to watch, because by then everyone knew what it meant. The marble had finished its journey. It had crossed deserts and rivers, had been cut, washed, dragged, floated, dried, polished. It had passed through the hands of quarrymen, sailors, priests, rope holders, and inspectors. Some of those hands had vanished. Some had changed shape. Some had simply let go. The raft moored at the southern edge of the Taj grounds. The stone was lifted. No one took a photograph. No ceremony was held, but the workers who stood nearby remembered how the wind died when the slab was set down. It was as if the river had exhaled one last time. The slab was smaller than most meant, not for the dome or the base, but for a narrow, interior hallway where sunlight never reached. A place not meant for eyes, only for structure. A support stone. Yet it arrived with the same reverence as those that lined the tomb itself. It was polished silently. A cloth soaked in lemon and goat milk was used to wipe its surface. A final layer of sand and chalk was rubbed in circles until the stone gleamed like water held in cupped hands. And then, slowly, it was slid into place. Not lifted, not pushed, just guided, like a prayer returning to its source. They say the last man to touch that stone was named Nand Kishore, a marble fitter from a long line of men who had worked temples and tombs across northern India. He wasn't famous. He didn't leave behind letters or poems, but according to his great-grandson, who, many decades later, recounted the story to a visiting historian, Nand did something unusual. After placing the final stone, he sat beside it, not just for a moment, but for hours, cross-legged, back against the wall, eyes closed, no tools in hand. When asked why, he reportedly said, "I wanted to see if the stone knew it was finished." That was the kind of thinking the Taj inspired. Not loud declarations, not grand announcements, just quiet moments of stillness that echoed for centuries. And in that stillness, something else was happening. The ropes were being coiled for the final time, not reused, not stored, but burned in the outer fields beyond the worksite. The leftover coils, some stained with oil, some frayed from years of pulling, were stacked and lit on fire. Not as an act of dismissal, but as a kind of offering, a ritual no priest had prescribed, but one the workers carried out on their own. The fire burned slowly, ash scattered in the direction of the river, and just like that, the journey was over. The marble no longer moved. It settled. It waited. And the Taj Mahal, though far from complete in decorative terms, had acquired its spine, tacit, its unmoving core. But of course, there is a strange irony in that final stillness, because the stone that had floated, that had been held and cleaned and carved and prayed over, now sat in a corridor no one visited. There was no plaque, no name, no indication that this had been the last piece to arrive. It simply was, and perhaps that was the point. The Taj Mahal was not built for fame, though fame found it. It was not built for tourists, though they now come by the millions. It was built as an act of devotion, of memory, of grief. And what better place for grief than in the quietest hallway, behind the loudest dome? Years later, when the British arrived and began surveying the monument, they brought instruments to measure angles and weight. They brought cameras to record shadows and cracks. One officer, trying to map the interior corridors, came upon the slab. He tapped it with a brass stick. Noticed how it gave off a different echo than the rest. "Denser marble," he wrote. No markings. He moved on. But a guard who had been watching from the archway later visited the spot again. An old man by then, the guard still remembered the day the raft had arrived. He remembered the silent wind, the way the river held its breath. He touched the marble dot and whispered, "You made it. That hallway is closed now, blocked for preservation, but the stone is still there, and if you pressed your ear to the wall beside it, if the corridor is empty and your heart is still, you might feel it. Not sound, not vibration, just a memory of movement, of water, of rope, of hands, and of the final journey." The marble maid alone. Asterisk. She was not a noblewoman, not a queen, not a poet. She had no lands, no lineage, and no last name written in any of the palace books. Yet her hands touched the feet of the emperor softly, carefully, and always in red. Her name was Maharunisa, though most in the Karkanagrass great royal workshop called her Rangan, the colorful one, but not because of her clothing. She wore plain cotton, bleached and boiled and worn, 2 threads, Cass. Not because of her voice, she rarely spoke more than she had to. It was because her hands never stopped staining. They were always red, not from henna, not from blood, but from a color older than either lac, crushed beetle resin from the forests of Bengal, scraped from the branches of host trees, soaked and pounded and boiled down until it became something between dye and memory. The kind of red that didn't fade when washed. The kind of red that made emperors pause mid-step. But lac was not an easy color. It stained everything it touched. The bowls that held it became brittle. The cloths that absorbed it could never be reused. Even the air above it seemed heavier, as if pulled down by the pigment. And yet, the Mughals wanted it. Not just for walls or robes or drapes, for shoes. Because the Emperor Shah Jahan, the man who dreamed of domes and tombs, refused to wear footwear that had been dyed by men. He believed women had softer hands, and he believed softness preserved dignity. So Rangan was assigned to the Karkana's dyeing wing, where she spent her days squatting over bronze basins, stirring fabric and thread into pools the color of old fire. But slippers were different. They had to be soaked, dried, softened, dyed again, and then polished, not with oil, but with rose water and ash to mute the shine. They had to look regal, but quiet, majestic, but restrained, and every step the emperor took in them was scrutinized. If they creased too soon, she was blamed. If they cracked in the sun, she was blamed. If the red bled onto his white garments, she was banished. That was the unspoken rule. Slipper dyers were never allowed to explain, only to succeed or disappear. Maharunisa worked beside 2 other women, both older, both silent, both missing the tips of at least 1 finger from years of handling caustic alum and saltpeter. They had long ago stopped speaking while they stirred, for fear that a single drop might splash and ruin the batch. Every morning, a leather satchel arrived from the palace, containing 6 unfinished slippers, camel hide stretched and stitched by tailors, uncolored and soft like new parchment. Her job was not to just dye them, but to make them match each other exactly. That was the hardest part, because lac changed shade with the weather and dry air. It turned crimson in humid air, almost plum. No two dyes were ever identical unless you knew how to lie to the color. Rangan lied with heat. She adjusted the coals beneath her basin by instinct, not by weight. She tested steam against her cheek. She dipped a corner of her scarf to gauge thickness. She whispered to the resin, not in words, but in memory. She remembered how it behaved in the monsoon, how it curled in winter, how thickened just before rain. And so, day by day, she perfected the lie. The slippers came out identical, not by chance, but by patience. Her hands, always stained red, became a signal in the carkhana. If the red was bright, the day would be smooth. If it dulled, people stepped carefully around her, afraid her mood might bleed. One morning, the new batch arrived, but the leather was different, stiffer, imported from the western ports, likely goat, not camel, unfamiliar in texture, unpredictable in soak. The supervisor handed them to her without a word. She understood. This was a test. The emperor's birthday was 3 weeks away. Rumors swirled that he intended to wear a new robe woven from Persian silk embroidered in silver and sea green. He needed slippers that would not clash, and he wanted them dyed once. No second batch, no corrections. She began immediately. First, she soaked the leather overnight in rose water to soften the grain. Then, she mixed a fresh batch of lac resin, boiled it with jaggery to stabilize the pigment, and added crushed tamarind seed to mute the color's brightness. These weren't tricks. They were secrets, learned from older women who had whispered them in broken breaths before dying of dye poisoning. The slippers were dipped just before sunrise, each one held beneath the surface for exactly 200 breaths, not counted aloud, but in the beat of her ribs. She dried them behind a curtain, never in sunlight, light warped color. Everyone knew that. When they were dry, she polished them with a linen cloth, soaked in musk and sandalwood. By noon, they were done, and they were perfect. The supervisor lifted one, turned it, held it against the others. He said nothing, but he didn't send them back, and that was how you knew you had passed that evening. As she washed her hands in a basin of ash and orange peel, she noticed the skin on her right thumb had turned completely pale, not from lack of pigment, but from loss of feeling. It was beginning. The dye had finally settled in her nerves, and she didn't mind. She wasn't born to write poetry, she wasn't born to stand in court, but she had dyed the emperor's slippers red, exactly, the right red, and that meant her hands had touched the feet of a dynasty without ever being seen. Asterisk. Taj Mahal was not yet finished, but parts of it were beginning to breathe. Some of the walkways had been paved. Some fountains had started trickling. The marble terraces were scrubbed with goat's milk at dawn. A new kind of silence hung over the site, no longer the noise of carving and chiseling, the low hush of something nearing completion. And into that silence walked the emperor, for the very first time, in slippers dyed red. They left no stain. That morning was recorded in no official diary, no court manuscript, but in the carkhana. They spoke of it with a reverence usually reserved for eclipses or omens. The emperor had crossed the marble's courtyard in his new slippers. The leather hadn't cracked. The color hadn't faded. There was no trace of dye on the marble flooring, a smudge, not a drop. When he paused near the central pool to look at the reflection of the white dome, one of the attendants knelt to adjust his robe. He looked down and nodded. That was all, but it changed everything. The next morning, Maharunisa was summoned, not to the palace, not to the public workshop, but to a small private room on the northern edge of the Carcana. It's a place where the emperor's personal staff reviewed items before they reached the royal court. It was rare for a dye worker to be summoned there. Rarer still for a woman. She arrived with her hands freshly scrubbed, but the red didn't come off. It never did inside. Two stewards stood beside a table. Laid out before her were 5 pairs of new slippers and dyed, soft, delicate as paper. One steward gestured. "Same red," he said. "By Friday." She did not ask which Friday. She only nodded. That evening, she returned to her corner of the dyeing hall. The other women did not speak. To her, not out of jealousy, out of recognition. She had crossed a threshold in the days that followed. A corner was rearranged. She was given a separate basin, a new coal pit, a canopy to shield the sunlight, even a silk cloth to cover her drying rack, a small, precious luxury in a world where cotton was usually boiled until it fell apart. But with the upgrades came scrutiny. Inspectors visited more often. They weighed the raw lac before it was given to her. They measured the water. They tested the fabric she used to blot the leather every morning. Guards stood outside the door of her chamber, not to protect her, but to protect the dye, because the color she had made was now imperial property. She had birthed it, but it no longer belonged to her. And still, she worked, not because she hoped for a reward or recognition, but because she had grown to understand the color better than she understood people. The way it changed with time, the way it refused to control, but surrendered gently when handled with silence. That week, as she prepared the next batch of slippers, she noticed something strange. The leather was thinner, not bad, just different, more absorbent. She adjusted her formula, less jaggery, more alum, longer soak, cooler dry. But when she lifted the first pair from the basin, something unusual happened. The red was deeper than usual, not bright, not dull, but bruised. She set it aside, dipped the next, same result. The color was correct, but it felt heavy as if it carried something inside it. Something unsaid. She stepped outside for air. The sky above the Taj had turned pale. A low haze was rising from the river, monsoon, and suddenly, she understood. The humidity wasn't just changing the dye, it was changing the leather. So she returned to her station and did something she had never done before. She rewrote her recipe on a torn piece of parchment. She noted every shift, drop by drop, minute by minute, the exact hour of the soak, the temperature of the cold bed, the way the color settled on the first dry corner of the slipper. She wrote as if someone might need to replicate it someday. She wrote for the first time, not to preserve her silence, but to preserve the color. And then she burned the paper, because she remembered what had happened to the women who passed down secrets too openly. You had to teach with your hands, not your words. That was how memory survived in places where ink didn't protect you. On Friday morning, the slippers were delivered, 5 pairs, perfectly matched. When the emperor's steward inspected them, he said nothing, but the next day, a letter was left on her work table. No seal, no signature, just a folded slip of parchment with a single sentence. The floor remains white. She folded it, placed it inside a hollow in her workbench, and never spoke of it again. But from that day on, no one called her Maharonisa, not even Rangin. She was simply the woman who dyed the emperor's feet. And in a world where names were forgotten and secrets vanished into walls, that was a kind of permanence marble could never promise. Asterisk, there was a time, many years later, when the Carcana began to grow quiet. Not because the emperor's appetite for beauty diminished, but because the work had shifted. The great dome of the Taj Mahal was finished. The main chambers were sealed. The inlay work moved indoors, and with it, the attention of the court. The bustling corridors of the dye rooms emptied, one by one, until only a handful of stations remained active. Mahara Mahanasaranjan, K. The woman with red-stained hands was no longer young. She had not dyed slippers in over a year. The emperor had turned his gaze toward other luxuries, velvets from the Deccan, rare sandalwood fans, ivory inlay work for palace columns. Footwear, for a time, became a quiet affair. Trusted artisans maintained the existing wardrobe. No new pairs were commissioned, but she remained, not because she had been asked to, but because no one had asked her to leave. And so, she stayed near the basin where her hands had once danced with steam and fire, polishing the edge of old bowls, sorting dried lac into jars, breathing in the faint memory of heat. She lived in a small chamber beside the dye hall, a room with no mirror, no paint, no window to the street. Just a mat, a cup, and a stone bowl of ash water to soak her hands. Her fingers no longer flexed properly. The nerves had stiffened. Her right thumb remained numb. Her eyes had blurred, but not from age, from years of staring into red. Red had shaped her, made her, and now it was fading from her skin. One wrinkle at a time. One morning, a new steward arrived from Delhi, young, ambitious, unfamiliar with the ways of the old workshop. He carried scrolls, lists, and a sharp quill. His first task, to survey the Karkhana and remove any names that no longer performed active work. When he reached Rangan station, he paused. He found no recent entries, no dye orders, no recorded output. "Who is she?" he asked one of the attendants. The attendant shrugged. "She's always been here." "What does she do?" "She dyed the emperor's slippers." "When?" "A long time ago." The steward scratched his beard. "Why is she still listed?" "'Cause no one removed her." The steward nodded, stepped forward, Sid gently called to her. She looked up. He asked her name. She smiled faintly and said nothing. She had not spoken aloud in weeks. He asked again. This time, she pointed to a wooden drawer beneath her basin. Inside was a small piece of folded linen. She motioned for him to take it. He unfolded the cloth inside. Pressed between two sheets of oiled paper was a sliver of red leather. Still bright, still silent. A perfect crescent cut from the edge of one of the emperor's first slippers. No note, no label, just the color. He stared at it for a long time, then looked at her. She had returned to her work, stinging old dye bowls with fingers that moved slowly, like they remembered a rhythm only she could hear. The steward left without crossing her name, and from that day on, her corner was never mentioned in audits again. She continued working, or rather, she continued being, until one morning. She didn't come to the dye hall. The mat in her chamber was neatly folded. Her hands, once red, now pale, rested beside a piece of cloth soaked in sanda, LWOOD. No one claimed her body. No family stepped forward, but in the drawer beneath her bench, folded tightly and sealed in beeswax, was a small scroll, written in trembling strokes, perhaps dictated to someone who could still hold a pen. It read, "Red must be finished in the shade. Not too fast, not too slow, not when you're tired, never when it rains." It was not a poem, it was a recipe, a warning, a memory, and it was passed on to the next woman who took her place, though none did, not right away, because no one wanted. 2 dye slippers after Rangan. They said the red never behaved the same again. Years later, when British surveyors documented the Taj Mahal in their field journals, they made note of the tile work, the symmetry, the calligraphy, the acoustics of the dome. They noted that the emperor's private wardrobe once contained over 100 pairs of red slippers, but they didn't know where they had gone. Only 2 pairs remained, preserved in silvered trunks. Now, darkened with age, the leather is intact. The dye has not faded. Experts debate what plant or mineral gave it such permanence. None suspect that it was not the ingredient, but the silence, the woman that made it last. Her name isn't on the palace rolls, not on the worker lists. It ran just a few steps away, the Yamuna River, slow and wide and ancient, wound itself around the Taj Mahal like a serpent in prayer. It mirrored the marble walls at dawn and whispered against the foundations at night. To any visitor standing at the edge of the platform, it would seem obvious the river was the lifeblood of the monument. Water, 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 forever flowing. And yet, the men who built the Taj did not use Yamuna water to mix its plaster. They refused. Not once. Not for the lime. Not for the mortar. Not even for the clay used to cool the scaffolds. Instead, teams of workers walked more than 3 kilometers inland to fetch it from a narrow well in a dusty grove shaded by neem trees. The water was lifted in copper pots, balanced on bamboo carts, and wheeled in silence toward the construction site. Why? Because Yamuna water, for all its grandeur, couldn't be trusted to stay still. The artisans said it had too much memory, too much motion, too much life. It carried silt from distant villages, iron from the hills. Even on clear days, it was never truly clear. When used to mix lime, the impurities rose to the surface. When added to the marble paste, the color dulled, and most importantly, refused to dry. The marble of the Taj had to be joined with a paste that set quickly, cleanly, and permanently. Every layer mattered. If the mortar remained wet, the stones would shift, and if the stones shifted, the dome, so delicately balanced on pressure and weight, could collapse. So the builders sent for dry water, water with no memory. The well they chose was old, predating even Akbar's reign. It ran deep, narrow, fed by a hidden aquifer beneath layers of fossilized earth. The water it offered was hard-rich in calcium and silence. It didn't swirl, sat a silent water for a silent monument. But drawing it wasn't easy. The ground was rocky, the path uneven, and the water carriers called Paniwapata, weave watermen, were often barefoot, moving day and night to fill massive clay cisterns that dotted the construction site. Each cistern had to be lined with goat tallow to keep the water cool. Each pot sealed with cloth to block dust. Each batch tested by touch, never sight. If the water felt too light, it was dismissed. If it warmed too fast in the hand, it was rejected. It was said that one of the master masons, a man named Hafiz, could tell the difference between Yamuna water and well water with a single drop on his wrist. He never used spoons, never tasted, just felt. And once, during the 7th year of construction, a shipment of marble paste was discarded in entire morning's work because Hafiz believed it had been mixed with river water by mistake. No one argued. The bricks were broken. The powder was remixed. The water pots were replaced. The man who had fetched the wrong batch was reassigned, not punished, but moved to work in the shade, far from the mortar station. That was the power water held. And yet, despite all this care, the Yamuna remained ever present. It cooled the air. It reflected the sky. It became a companion to the stone. But it was never allowed inside the walls, at least not until monsoon, because during monsoon, everything changed. The Yamuna rose like a sleeping god stirred from dreams. It swallowed the banks, flooded the outer walkways, sometimes even reached the base of the red sandstone platform on which the Taj Mahal stood. And in those days, the air was so wet that even the well water refused to dry. Mortar turned soft. Lime grew heavy. The builders waited not with impatience, but with understanding. They placed brass bowls upside down over half-laid joints, hoping to slow the water's creep. They polished the marble not with cloth, but with sand, letting abrasion do what moisture would not. And when the rain stopped, Kay listened, because the marble made a sound when it was ready, a faint tick, like a breath exhaled through stone. That was when you knew it was time to seal the next layer, time to add the next line of script, time to raise the next arch. You might think this obsession with water sounds excessive, but the Taj Mahal's beauty is not just in its shape, or size, or shine. It's in its silence, its refusal to move, and that silence was made possible only by choosing which water to use and which to leave behind. Even now, centuries later, engineers marvel at the tightness of the marble joints, how the paste has not loosened, how the tiles have not shifted, and they wonder what chemicals were used, what ancient science was applied. But the truth is simpler. The builders of the Taj Mahal did not rely on formulas. They relied on feeling, on heat and weight and patience, and above all in water without memory. Asterisk. He arrived at the site every morning before anyone else, long before the masons stirred, before the painters unwrapped their brushes, before even the guards changed shifts. He would walk the eastern path in silence, carry a small wooden bucket, and lower it slowly into the test cistern beside the lime preparation yard. No words, just water. His name was Chirag Das, but no one called him by it. Among the workers, he was known only as the ear, not because of how he looked or how he spoke. He rarely did, but because of what he could hear or claim to. It was said that Chirag Das could hear water think, that he could tell by sound alone whether the water had traveled too far, sat too long, or carried something it shouldn't. And while many dismissed it as superstition, no one ever dared mix mortar. Without his nod, he was not a chemist, not a priest, not a supervisor, but his presence was treated like an omen. When he dipped his fingers into the morning water and nodded, men worked faster. The lime men sang. The masons smiled. When he frowned, the scaffolds stayed quiet, as if the stone knew it wasn't time to rise. His method was absurdly simple. He placed the water in a shallow brass dish, tilted it slightly, and waited for the first drop to fall. Then he listened, sometimes with his ear to the wood, sometimes with his hand over the rim. The sound, he claimed, told him everything: the mineral content, the freshness, the willingness of the water to bind with lime. And perhaps it wasn't nonsense, because Chirag Das's judgments, though never explained, were rarely wrong. There was one particular day that workers remembered. The 12th day of the 9th monsoon. The Yamuna had been swollen for weeks. The inner corridors of the Taj's lower level were damp. The well water was running cloudy, still usable, but uncertain. Everyone knew the dome segment scheduled for that week was risky. A curve of the upper vault had to be joined. The paste had to be flawless. If it softened, it would crack. If it cracked, the entire section would have to be removed. The engineers were nervous, but the orders from the palace were clear. Proceed. And so, they looked to Chirag Das. He tested the batch of water himself 3 times, once with his hand, once with his ear, and once with a length of cotton thread, which he dipped and wrung dry. Then he walked away. No words, just a slight shake of the head. The head mason halted the work. For 6 hours, nothing happened. Workers sat idle. Tools remained untouched. It was a dangerous decision, pausing the emperor's dream for a feeling. But the mason trusted the silence more than the command. That evening, the rains returned heavier than before. The entire southern face of the site was drenched. Had they laid the dome section, it would have collapsed by morning. The next day, Chirag returned, tested again, nodded. Work resumed. No one ever questioned his method again. Over time, Chirag's small water hut beside the cistern became a kind of shrine, not decorated or honored, but respected. No one left buckets there without permission. No one touched his cloths. And when he wasn't present, work slowed, whether from caution or reverence. It was hard to say. He aged quietly. His back stooped. His voice thinned, but his hearing remained. And in his final year at the site, Ki did something unexpected. He began training a boy, not a relative, not a chosen apprentice, just a mute orphan who had wandered near the limeyard one morning and seemed to mimic Chirag's gestures without prompting. The boy couldn't speak. but he could listen. And so, Chirag taught without words. He showed the boy how to feel the rim of a bowl, how to hold a thread above steam, how to judge the angle of a drip by the way it shivered when it touched the brass. He called the boy Sanu Quiet One. When Chirag died, no announcement was made. The Karkhana simply folded a length of white cotton, placed it near the water hut, and let the sun fall on it. The next day, Suna sat at the same brass bowl. No one stopped him, and when the first drop fell, he waited, then gave a single nod. Work resumed. Years later, when British engineers surveyed the mortars used in the Taj, they marveled at its resilience. It hadn't crumbled. It hadn't warped. Even the joints beneath the dome remained tight, sound, weatherproof. They analyzed its contents: lime, sirki, jaggery, fenugreek, brick dust, but never the water, because water, they said, was just water. They didn't know about Chirag Das, or Sunu, or the brass bowl that once heard every whisper of the well. They didn't know that the most important ingredient in the Taj's plaster wasn't in the mixture. It stood beside it, with its ear to the ground, listening. Asterisk. There was no scroll, no golden page tucked away in the royal archives. No official formula sent down from the emperor's court to explain how the Taj Mahal's plaster should be mixed. Instead, there were hands, there were rhythms, there were memories passed not in ink, but in habit. And at the center of this quiet miracle was the line past a substance so smooth, so consistent, so impossibly enduring that centuries later, it still holds the marble slabs of the Taj together without cracking, swelling, or pulling apart. It was not simply lime and water. It was something older, a knowledge that even the builders barely understood in words, but mastered through generations of touch. The process began not with stone, but with fire. Kilns burned around the clock, fed with tamarind wood and cow dung. Inside, limestone rocks, collected from distant hills, were baked until they glowed and cracked. The resulting substance, quicklime, was brittle and dangerous. When water touched it, it hissed and fumed, so it had to be tamed. And to tame it, the workers added jaggery, coarse, golden sugarand uridal, split black lentils, ground to a powder. These weren't flavorings, they were stabilizers. The jaggery slowed the reaction. The dal added protein, which bound the mixture more firmly, like tendons in a muscle. The mixture was stirred for days, not hours. Days, men took turns. One stirred with a wooden paddle. One cooled the sides with wet cloth. One watched the surface, waiting for a particular kind of bubble, a kind that didn't break right away, but lingered like a breath held too long. That's when they knew the mixture was ready to rest. Then came the drying. But the mixture wasn't dried in the sun. It was buried, yes, buried, beneath sand and ash for up to a month. Why? Because quicklime is temperamental. Too much air, and it hardens into useless chalk. Too little, and it remains caustic. Buried in sand, it cured slowly, evenly, quietly, when it was finally unearthed. The paste was no longer hot. It was cold, cool to the touch, silky, heavy, like butter left in a well. This was the moment the well water came in. Not too much, just enough, and only after Chirag Dasord later, Sanu had tested it. When mixed, the paste didn't run. It held. Workers described it as sleeping glue, silent, slow, strong, and yet it wasn't used everywhere, only in the important joints: the dome, the column bases, the lower plinths. Lesser areas used simpler mortar, but the joints that carried pressure, that held elegance in balance, those were sealed with this silent paste. And in one corner of the Karkhana, Tia, there was a woman named Bano, whose sole job was to carry the paste from the barrels to the scaffold. She walked barefoot, always barefoot, not out of devotion, but precision. She said shoes made her spill. and she couldn't afford to spill. Each pot she carried weighed nearly 20 kilos. She balanced it on her head with one hand, steadying it, and another, shading the mixture from the sun. She climbed stairs, narrow planks, makeshift ladders. She never dropped a single load. She did this for 6 years. When her arms began to ache permanently, she tied flat stones to her wrists at night, to realign the muscles. She didn't complain, because the paste was more than plastered. It was trust. A bad paste meant shifting marble. A bad paste meant collapse. A good paste meant silence forever later. After the Taj was completed, when Bano was asked by a visitor what the mixture was made of, she laughed and said, "You can't. Write it down. Spoils when read." And maybe that was true, because when the British arrived, they tried to recreate it. They analyzed the ingredients, cated the ratios. Their mixtures cracked within years. Too brittle, too dry, too dry, too dry, too. Because the original paste wasn't perfect in the modern sense. It was alive. It changed with season, adjusted to mood, responded to silence. Even today, engineers marvel at the way it holds, not just by force, but by harmony. The marble of the Taj doesn't press tightly against itself. It rests, and that rest is made possible by the space the paste provides, a soft tension, a living stillness. It is said that the inner dome, where sound travels in slow echoes, owes its clarity, not to shape alone, but to the mortar between the layers. The paste absorbs just enough sound to let the echo dance, but not shout. It is the hidden music of the Taj, made not from stone, but from a forgotten recipe, carried in warm pots, poured by quiet hands, and stirred by people who never wrote a single word of what they knew, but held history together anyway. Asterisk's name was never carved into the Taj Mahal, not on its walls, not beneath its stone, not even in the foundations, where some workers quietly scratched their initials with the corner of a nail or the tip of a chisel. He had no plaque, no statue, no painted portrait in the royal court, and yet every line of the monument followed the shape of his thought. They called him Ustad Isa, which simply meant Master Isa, but even that name is more missed than marble, its accuracy debated, his origins uncertain. Some said he came from Shiraz. Others claimed he was born in Delhi. Still others whispered of Samarkand, Turkish ink, and Persian light. What is certain is this: he designed the Taj Mahal, and then, when offered a palace for his labor, he asked only for silence, but silence doesn't make it into records. So, today, most people have forgotten him. Let us begin at the beginning, when Shah Jahan's beloved wife, Mumtaz Mahal, died in childbirth. In 1631, the emperor withdrew from the world. He mourned for weeks in seclusion. And then, one morning, he summoned his ministers and said only this: "It must be made. It must outlive us both." There were dozens of architects already in Agra, men who had built mosques, forts, tombs, gardens. But Shah Jahan did not want a building. He wanted a pause in time, and so the search widened. Letters were sent across Persia, Bukhara, Isfahan. Months passed. Offers arrived. Blueprints were reviewed. But none pleased the emperor, until a letter came with no sketch, no wax seal, only a poem, 4 lines, written in a calligraphy so fine the ink seemed to hover. If grief can stand it, must be still. If love must rest, it must be stone. If memory is to last, let silence shape it, can let no name follow. The court was puzzled. The emperor was not. "Find this man," he said, and they did. Ustad Isa did not come in royal garb. He traveled alone, carrying only a single wooden case of drawing tools and a copper water flask. He wore dark robes with no embroidery. He refused a litter. He entered Agra on foot. When he arrived at court, he bowed only once. Shah Jahan asked him if he could make a monument that defied time. Isa replied, "I can try to design something that won't chase it." And from that moment, the work began, but not as one might imagine. Ustad Isa didn't draw at first. He watched. For weeks, he walked the land near the Yamina, measured the sun with his palm, dug his fingers into the soil, tapped stones with his knuckles. He stood at dawn, barefoot, where the marble platform would one day rise, just to see how morning felt there. When asked what he was doing, he said, "I'm learning where silence already lives." Only after 40 days did he pick up his instruments. His drawings were unusual, not symmetrical at first glance. He sketched sound curves paths that controlled how wind would move, how footsteps would echo, how whispers would reach corners and dissolve. He designed the Taj not for sight, but for feeling. Every proportion was calculated not just for beauty, but for breath. He argued with masons over half inches, rejected hundreds of inlay motifs because they were too loud, chose marble not only for its sheen, but for its quiet. He had a strange habit. He would place a cup of water in the center of a room before it was built, then ask the workers to walk around it. If the water rippled, he redesigned the floor. His logic: movement disturbed water, it would disturb grief. And a Taj, above all, was meant to be a place where grief could rest. He spent weeks with the gardeners, instructing them where to plant cypresses and where to dig channels, not for aesthetics, but for rhythm. The sound of water moving was to be consistent, predictable, like the breath of someone remembering a name in their sleep. And yet, when the emperor asked him to leave his name on a tile, he refused. "I am not a name," Isa said. "I am a shadow. If it stands, let the marble speak. If it falls, let it fall nameless." Shah Jahan didn't argue. He gave Isa a room in the eastern quarter, far from the noise. No servants, just a table, a candle, and a bowl of sand to erase drafts with his palm. No one knows how many drawings he made. Most were never preserved. He would tear them after they were executed, not from arrogance, from principle. He believed the final building was the only version that mattered. Not the dream, not the plan, only the shape that held. Sorrow without collapsing under it. By the time the Taj's main dome was completed, Isa had withdrawn even further. He no longer visited the site during the day. He came at night, walking alone under scaffolds, listening to how the moonlight fell across unfinished stone. One worker claimed he once heard him, murmur to the marble, "Don't gleam too brightly. Don't show off. You are not love. You are the silence after it." And in many ways, that is what he built. Not a monument to a woman, but the shape of her absence. Asterisk. By the 7th year of construction, the Taj Mahal had begun to rise beyond its own shadow. The marble platform was finished. The 4 minarets stood tall, tipped like quills waiting to write prayers into the sky. The decorative workers had arrived, carrying boxes of lapis lazuli, turquoise, and mother of pearl, all to be set into vines in calligraphy that would never be raised above a whisper. But the dome, the heart of the monument, was not yet built, and for Ustad Isa, the dome was not merely a roof. It was a gesture, a full stop in marble, soft hand resting on the head of memory. He delayed it. Again and again, engineers pushed. Schedules tightened. The court grew anxious. But Isa refused to raise the dome until the sound was ready. He believed that a dome was not measured by its height, but by how it held quiet. And so he spent 3 months beneath a cloth tent in the center of the unfinished chamber, building wooden models, testing curves with clay, and listening. Always listening. He placed musicians at the corners of the chamber, flutists, drummers, singers, not to perform, but to breathe, to let sound rise and die, and to study where it landed. Every echo mattered. If it returned too quickly, the dome would feel crowded. If it vanished too slowly, it would feel hollow. The balance had to be exactly the space between inhale and exhale. He used tools no one understood. Hollow reeds filled with sand, clay bowls turned upside down, goat skins stretched tight and plucked with one finger. He watched the dust rise from the floor when notes were played, tracing the air with his eyes. And when, finally, the air stilled, he gave the nod. Construction resumed, but even then, he changed the process. Most domes were built with inward spirals of scaffolding timber circles that held weight from within. Isa reversed it. He ordered external scaffolds only so that the inner ear would remain untouched, clean, unbothered by wooden pressure. The workers were confused. The engineers were appalled. But the emperor trusted him. And so, the dome began to bloom petal by petal, stone by stone, into the sky. And as it rose, Isa visited it nightly, checking each joint by sound. He tapped each block with the side of his knuckle. If the tone wasn't right, he removed it. Not because it was weak, because it didn't belong. He was not building for sight. He was building for echo. One night, a worker asked him why the dome had no inscription. The mosques had verses, the walls had prayers, why nothing on the dome? Isa looked up at the half-finished curve, then said, because grief needs no reminder. When the final stone was laid centered, like the dot beneath a breath, Isa did not celebrate. He stood at the center of the inner chamber, clapped once, and listened. The sound circled the room once, then vanished, perfect. In the days that followed, offers began pouring in. The court wanted to reward him. A palace in Lahore, jewels, a silk robe lined with gold thread, a permanent place among the emperor's scholars. He refused them all. Instead, made a single request, that his name not be carved, that he receive no land, that a small garden near the river, where the lime workers once washed their hands be, left to grow wild, untouched, unmarked. Shah Jahan was baffled. You designed what might outlast the empire, he said. You deserve to be remembered. To which Isa replied, I will be, in the way it feels to walk here barefoot, in the breath that returns to your chest when the dome releases sound, in the stillness that outlives your footsteps, not as a name, as a hush. And so it was done. The garden was left unmarked, a few trees, a patch of reeds, the sound of wind moving through stone. He stayed in Agra for a few more months, oversaw the finishing touches, the arch tracings, the drainage lines, the hidden slopes in the garden paths meant to catch moonlight without reflecting it into the tomb. Then one morning, he left. No procession, no farewell, just the silence of someone who had finished their sentence and closed the book. No one knows where he went. Some say he returned to Persia. Others say he crossed the mountains and lived in a monastery. A few believe he never left at all, that he lives in memory, somewhere inside the Taj itself, not in a grave, not in a statue, but in the shapes. He chose not to sign asterisk on the northern edge of the Taj Mahal, beyond the perfectly proportioned fountains and the marble platforms, beyond the symmetry of rose beds and cypress lines. Past even the gaze of the caretakers, there was a patch of land left wild. It wasn't fenced. It wasn't watered by the court gardeners. No. Walkways led to it. No signs pointed toward it. But if you followed the soft slope of the terrain just beyond the river's edge, you would find it a quiet garden, barely a garden at all, where grasses grew freely. Reeds swayed in slow rhythm, and a single stone bench, cracked and lopsided, faced nothing in particular. This, they say, was used at Isa's only request, a garden that asked nothing of the visitor, no awe, no reverence, not even attention. It was not a tribute. It was a release, a place for the mind to uncoil after wandering through the weight of perfection. And yet, even in its wildness, it carried his design. Trees were chosen, not for color, but for sound. Tamarind that rattled in the wind. Neem that rustled softly when brushed. Grasses that whispered when a bird passed overhead. There was no water feature. Only dew could collect it naturally in the hollow of stones, evaporating by midday, remembered by no one but the ants and the roots that drank silently. The Taj Mahal, in all its glory, was a monument to lost public, vast, deliberate. But this garden, it was where private loss could breathe, where the architect who had spent years flattening his ego, into lines and ratios, could finally let something grow unevenly. There is a story ever confirmed, but told by old caretakers, that Shah Jahan once walked into this patch by mistake. He had come to oversee marble polishing on the southern pavilion. The court had arranged a platform for him. A new robe had been pressed. The emperor, restless, took a path alone and wandered down the embankment, drawn by the wind. When he reached the garden, he stopped. No guards followed. No ministers interrupted. He stood there for nearly half an hour, then sat, not on the bench, on the ground, on the wild, soft grass that left faint marks on his robe. When his attendants found him later, they hesitated sure whether to disturb him. The emperor rose without a word and returned to the main path. But after that day, a small instruction was sent to the palace kitchen: no cutting from the north garden. That instruction remained for decades. No one touched the space. No one planted, no one pruned. And still, the garden flourished, fed not by design, but by time. Visited not by travelers, but by silence itself. When British surveyors arrived in the 19th century, they mapped every feature of the Taj. They took precise measurements of the dome, cataloged every stone, noted the alignment of fountains to celestial markers. But when they reached the north garden, they labeled it untamed margin of no consequence. And in that phrase, they missed everything, because it was the margin that gave the text meaning. The Taj Mahal was a poem. But this garden, this patch of gentle disorder, was the space around the words. The exhale after the vow. The blink after a name is remembered, but not spoken. When caretakers grew old, they often took their final rest in that garden. Not to die there, but to sit, unburdened by the weight of duty. To remember without names. To listen without needing answers. It became tradition and official. Unwritten that when a new worker joined the maintenance crew, he was brought there first. Not for training, just to sit. 1 hour. Nothing more. No explanation given. Because some knowledge, they believed, arrived not through instruction, but through stillness. The bench, now nearly sunken into the earth, was never repaired. No one knew who carved it. Some say Isa himself did, on his last day, using leftover marble discarded during construction. Others believe it was brought by the wind, but it remains, facing no monument, no stone, no axis of power, just the sky, the same sky that once looked down on a man who designed the most perfect building in the world, then walked away from it, not because he didn't care, but because he had finished listening, and in the pause that followed, he built his greatest work, a space that let grief rest without architecture. Asterisk. The Taj Mahal sleeps, not literally, not like a body, but there are hours when the sun has vanished behind the river, when the last footsteps have echoed down the red sandstone path, when even the fountains hold their breath, when the monument feels less like a building and more like a presence, a memory that watches. And in those hours, someone always watched back. They were called Rati Chakadars, the night watchmen, not soldiers, not nobles, just quiet men with slow feet, trained eyes, and good ears. They didn't wear armor. They carried no blades, just a wooden staff, a whistle carved from bone, and a lantern shielded with cloth, so the light would flicker, but not cast shadows. They walked in circles, okay? Always in circles, never straight lines, because straight lines could be memorized, attacked. Circles could adapt. Circles meant no beginning, no end. Most people thought the Taj didn't need guards. Who would steal from a tomb? What could be taken from stone and silence? But the emperor knew better, because memory, once built, had to be protected. So he ordered 12 men to watch the site from sundown to sunrise, every night, without fail. 6 walked, 6 slept. Every 2 hours, the roles reversed. It was a rhythm older than the marble itself. One of those men was named Khalil. He had no family name. His parents had died in a grain riot. He'd grown up in a tent outside the southern gate, watching the monument rise. When he turned 15, he was given a choice: carry bricks or carry silence. He chose the latter. By 30, he had become the most trusted of the watchmen. Not because he spoke well, he rarely did. Not because he fought well, he'd never lifted a sword, but because he noticed what others missed. He knew the sound of lime cracking under moonlight. He could tell when marble had been disturbed by hand or wind. He could sense when footsteps echoed wrong, too soft, too sharp, too hurried. And the Taj Mahal, he claimed, had moods. Some nights it hummed gently. Other nights it pressed down on you, as if asking you to walk slower, breathe quieter. On rare occasions it whispered, shift in air, a cold patch in summer, a creak in a place with no beams. He never feared it. He simply adjusted. He never called it a building. He called it the widow, because it mourned without tears, and because it didn't like to be left alone. His shift always began the same way. He'd step into the eastern gate just as the final workmen were departing. He'd nod to the gatekeeper, then walk the length of the reflecting pool, stopping once to glance at the moon's reflection in the water. If it was sharp, the night would be quiet. If it shimmered, something would happen. This wasn't superstition. It was experience. One night, the moon shimmered, and a stone had shifted. Just one in the outer wall near the garden steps. Barely noticeable. No break, no crack. But it had moved enough that the echo of his footstep bounced oddly. He heard it, paused, tapped the wall with his staff, listened again, then marked it with a thread soaked in oil. By morning, the wall team was alerted. They investigated, found that a tree root planted 2 close decades ago had pushed beneath the foundation and nudged the marble half a finger's width. If Khalil hadn't marked it, it might have been missed. If it had been missed, water could have entered. If water entered, the wall could have warped. It was a thread, no thicker than silence, that held the monument upright, and men like Khalil carried that thread in their steps. He never told the other watchmen what to listen for. They weren't interested. Some drank on their shift. Some slept early. But Khalil walked always with one hand brushing the edge of the stone. Not enough to dirty it, just enough to feel if it was breathing differently. He believed the Taj responded to presence, not crowds. Singular presence. And, in return, it offered signs. A soft breeze in a closed corridor, a puddle that dried faster than the others, a patch of marble warmer than the rest. He noted these changes, not in a book. He didn't know how to write, but in his body. His knees remembered the weight of the steps. His shoulders knew where echoes leaned. One evening, during his 53rd year of service, he noticed something he'd never noticed before as he passed beneath the main arch, where the calligraphy draws your eye toward the heavens. He looked, not up, but down at the edge of the floor, and saw a hairline crack, perfectly straight, no wider than a grain of rice. It hadn't been there the night before. He crouched, touched it. It was warm, not hot, not glowing, just warm, as if the monument had sighed in its sleep and left a mark. He didn't panic. He simply walked the rest of his shift in tighter circles. The next morning, he waited at the eastern gate for the foreman to arrive. Said nothing, just pointed dot and then left. He did not return that night, or the night after. His staff was left hanging on the gatepost, wrapped in a cloth from his lantern. Some say he felt his duty was complete. Others say he'd been listening so long, could finally rest. But the mark remained, sealed quickly by the repairmen, barely visible now, just a line in marble that only Kaleem saw before it grew. And to this day, no one walks the night circuit without first checking that corner, not because they're told to, but because silence asked them to. Asterisk years passed. The emperor aged, the river shifted, but the night watchman remained. New faces, new shoes, new eyes, but the same slow rhythm across marble floors that had once been warmed by moonlight and now cooled under the weight of memory. The Taj Mahal did not change, not in shape, not in color, but in feeling. With every watchman who walked her empty halls, a different silence was carried through her corridors. After Kaleem disappeared, there was unease among the crew. Not fear exactly, but absence. He had never trained a replacement, had never written anything down, but his quiet vigilance had shaped the way others moved, even if they didn't admit it. His disappearance left a gap larger than a broken stone. One of the younger guards, a man named Farouk, began tracing his path, not because he had been told to, but because he had heard Kaleem's footsteps once and remembered how they had sounded measured, deliberate, almost like a clock whose ticks were heard only by stone. So Farouk began listening. He slowed down, began carrying a thinner lantern, wore softer shoes, and then, one night, something strange happened. He was walking the western corridor, rarely used path, near the outer walls. The moon was low, shadows long. He paused to take a sip of water, set his lantern down, and heard footsteps behind him. Not loud, just present, like someone walking barefoot across silk. He turned. No one. The shadows were flat, the walls still, the trees beyond the screen unmoving. He picked up the lantern and continued walking. The sound followed, always 3 steps behind. He stopped. So did it. He stepped sideways. It didn't. That was when he realized it wasn't a person. It was a memory, a rhythm so deeply embedded into the marble that it replayed itself when the air was still and the listener was willing. He didn't run, he didn't speak, he just walked, and for the rest of that night, footsteps stayed with him, steady, quiet, watchful, like a partner he never saw. When morning came, he said nothing, but he placed his lantern back on the hook the way Kaleem used to, wick facing out, cloth tied in a single knot. From that day forward, the guards began whispering about the second step. They said that when a man walked the inner circle of the Taj at night, and if he was truly listening, he would hear a second set of steps, always behind, never ahead, never racing, just matching him. Some said it was Kaleem. Others said it was the Taj itself, walking with whoever agreed to carry its silence. This did not frighten them. In fact, it comforted them, because it meant the monument was not entirely asleep, that it still noticed, still listened, but not all footsteps were so gentle. One night, during the waning moon, another watchman said occurred something else. He was walking near the south gate, where the marble meets the garden's edge. The wind was strange, too warm for the season. And there, beneath the first arch, he saw a dark figure, standing, not moving, back turned. At first, he thought it was another guard. He called out. No answer. He stepped forward. The figure didn't flinch, just stood there, looking into the garden, as if waiting for something that hadn't arrived. Siddiq lifted his lantern. There was no face, not missing, just not present. like the figure wasn't a person, but a memory that had never fully formed. He blinked, and it was gone. No footsteps, no rustling, just absence. The next morning, he told the senior guard. They checked the records. No one was scheduled for that post. No visitors had entered. No exits had been logged. The entry in the guard's book for that hour was left blank. But Siddiq never walked alone again. He always took a partner and always carried 2 lanterns, one to see and one to be seen. The night guards understood in time that the Taj Mahal was not just a monument to grief. It was a repository, a vessel that held not only love and architecture, but the echoes of those who had loved too deeply, labored too quietly, and watched too long. And some of those echoes walked still, not to haunt, not to frighten, but to accompany, because grief, when built from devotion, does not vanish. It settles, it walks, and those who walk with it, without question, without demander, never truly alone. Asterisk, by the time his hair had turned white, Farouk no longer needed a lantern. He knew the walkways blind. He knew where the marble whispered. He knew which stones sighed when stepped on. He could walk from the southern gate to the river terrace without raising his heel too loudly, without the hem of his robe brushing too hard against the sandstone. And in all those years, nearly for decades, he never once requested a different post. Other guards came and went. Some transferred to the palace. Others married, left the city, passed on. Farouk remained. Not out of duty, but because he believed the Taj still required witnessing, not guarding, not patrolling, just someone to be there, someone to acknowledge its stillness. It became known among the newer watchmen that if they ever lost something, keys, thread, or even courage, they should find Farouk. He never scolded, never asked why they'd failed. Asterisk. He just sat, always in the same place, near the first bend in the garden path, beside a patch of jasmine that only bloomed in the second half of the night. He had started sleeping there. Alcasonallya. Habit, born not of fatigue, but peace. One night, a young guard asked him why he never brought a pillow. Farouk answered, without turning his head, I sleep beside something that never blinks. It will wake me if needed. And somehow, it always did. If a dog strayed too near, if a gust of wind knocked a lantern loose, if a visitor tried to climb the gates, Farouk stirred. It was as if he and the monument shared a rhythm that neither interrupted nor questioned. They simply listened to one another. Toward the end of his life, he stopped walking full circuits. His knees wouldn't allow it. Instead, he circled only once per night, always at the same hour, just after the moon reached its apex. He walked from the east gate, across the reflection pool, past the prayer chamber, then stopped at the main tomb entrance. He'd press his palm against the marble not hard, just enough to feel its temperature. Then he'd close his eyes, breathe once, and return. That was all. And yet, everyone who saw him perform this act spoke of it as a kind of ritual, small ceremony that allowed the Taj to know it was still remembered, still watched, still loved. 1 year, during the monsoon, the river flooded unexpectedly. Water reached the lower gates. Some of the outer chambers had to be evacuated. Drainage crews worked overnight. Stone polishers arrived by dawn. But in all the chaos, Farouk did not move. He remained near the jasmine patch, seated cross-legged with his cloak pulled tight. When asked why, he said only, "She's already wet. I'm just keeping her company." By she, he meant the Taj. He always spoke of it as a woman, not in romance, but in respect, as something that mourned, waited, endured. Something that did not ask to be remembered, yet was remembered anyway. Eventually, his name disappeared from the official guard roster, not out of neglect, but because there was no one left to sign. him off, and no one dared stop him. When he finally stopped coming, no ceremony was held. No grave was marked, but in the jasmine patch, someone left his staff. It's tied with a strip of white cloth. It remains there still. The cloth is replaced each year, quietly, by hands that never admit who they belong to. It's not an act of worship, just a gesture, a nod, a reminder that someone once waited for nothing and still chose to stay. The younger guards now speak of Farouk the way older generations once spoke of Kleem, not as a ghost, not as a myth, but as a thread, one that still lingers in the breeze that moves between the domes, in the breath of the trees that line the path, in the echo of footsteps that vanish before they finish. And if you walk the grounds of the Taj at night, very late, when even the guards are beginning to nod off and you happen to pause by the jasmine, you may feel something near your shoulder. Not a touch, not a sound, just a brief weight in the air, as if someone turned to look at you and then looked away. Not because you don't matter, but because the Taj has already been seen, and that's enough. Asterisk, the Taj Mahal appears to float. That's what most say when they first see it. It rises from the earth with such grace, such soft certainty, that one forgets how impossible it should be. The structure is massive white marble domes, red sandstone plinths, towering minarets, all built beside a riverbank, all standing as if weightless. But wait, as the builders knew, it's not just about mast, it's about trusting the earth to carry grief without breaking, and the earth beneath the Taj could not be trusted. It was soft, clay, heavy, shifting, the kind of ground that swelled in summer and sank after rain, the kind of ground that swallows small buildings over time without a sound. So long before the first marble was laid, before the carving began, before even the platform was raised, the ground had to be told how to hold still. And that's where the wells began. 22 of them, hand-dug in silence, one after another, arranged in a grid that no one ever sees now because it lies buried beneath the Taj itself, beneath its massive red sandstone platform. Each well was about 15 meters deep and lined with brick and lime, not to draw water, but to draw stillness. These were not wells in the ordinary sense. They were called Bali Chabatras by the workers' foundation wells, bored into the mud, not to extract, but to support. They worked by creating downward pressure, compacting the soil below, allowing the stone to breathe above. The man in charge of this invisible architecture was Mumtazeddin, a specialist in subterranean structures, sent from Lahore by order of the emperor's chief architect. He had dug foundations for forts. He had laid platforms for palaces. But when he arrived in Agra and tested the soil near the Yamuna, he reportedly said, "This ground forgets. It forgets what's placed on it. It forgets how to stay still. It needs memory carved into it." So he ordered the wells, not 10, not 15.20-2, each placed with precision, spaced by calculation. Their mouths wide, their sides coated with a mixture of lime, jaggery, lentils, and crushed stones like the mortar used in the building above. But this mixture had one extra ingredient, molasses, added not for strength, for flexibility, because the earth moves, and when it does, it needs to stretch without cracking. The digging was done by hand, mostly by men from villages downstream. They were used to the river's moods, to the softness of the soil, to the way your hands blistered differently when the earth is wet. They dug day and night. 2 ships of machines, no pulleys. A man named Raju became the unofficial leader of the well diggers, not because he was strongest, but because he never let the walls collapse. He had a method, simple, brilliant. Before digging, he would pour water onto the surface and listen. If it disappeared too fast, the soil was unstable. If it pooled, it was ready. Then, as the digging progressed, he lined the walls not with bricks first, but with woven bamboo rings. These rings acted like ribs, holding shape until the lime was poured. He trained dozens of others. Some of them didn't last. The work was dangerous. The air was bad. The mud shifted at night, and yet they persisted because they knew something few others did. The Taj Mahal would stand on what no one would ever see. Every morning, Raju would descend first. He'd check for gas with a flame. He'd tap the base with his staff to test for hollows. He'd sing once, just once, before letting others enter. If the note echoed back clean, it was safe. If it came back muddy, they waited. They dug all through the hot season. During the rains, it worked under tents, with water pumped out by hand. One well collapsed in the second month. 2 men died. No names recorded, just a pause in the ledger. Then the count resumed by the 7th month. They reached the deepest point in all 22 wells, and that's when the real work began, because the wells weren't just empty shafts. They were to be filled again with stone, lime, and silence. Each well became a pillar underground. Each was packed with crushed rock, brick fragments, and special mortar, layer by layer, pounded down by hand until it held not just weight, but intention. It was said that the final tap of each well sent a thud so deep that birds stopped chirping. That's how they knew it was ready. And when the platform was laid, it sat not on the earth, but on 22 memories carved into mud and then forgotten. Even today, structural engineers studying the Taj are baffled. There are no signs of sinking, no cracks from shifting foundations, no erosion from the river's rise and fall. Just an unshakable platform holding centuries of grief, love, and stone. What they cannot see, what they do not know, is that beneath it all lies the work of men who built wells into the ground, not for water, but to keep the sky from falling. Asterisk, the wells were silent. They made no sound when filled. No song was sung. No prayer was whispered. No garland laid across the mouth of the last shaft. And yet, for those who had stood waist deep in the cool mud, hands covered in lime and molasses, the moment of completion felt like something sacred. 22 wells, perfectly spaced, lined with rings of stone and mortar, sealed with nothing but pressure and faith. Now came the next step, the platform. But platforms are not made of marble. Not it. First, they begin with brick. Thousands of bricks, low-fired, uneven, not beautiful, not white, but strong, flexible, humble. The kind of material that is rarely spoken of, but which carries the most weight. And so it was with the Taj asterisk, the platform, the massive red sandstone stage upon which the white mausoleum rises was first. Built with bricks stacked in interlocking patterns, bonded not just with lime, but with intention. The bricks were made in nearby kilns. Their clay pulled from earth close enough to the river to hold its memory. Each one was shaped by hand, dried in rows beneath thatch to protect it from the unpredictable agri-sun. Supervising this phase was a man named Ramat Ali. He was not a designer, not a scholar. Asterisk, he was a counter. His gift was rhythm, not architecture. He could track thousands of bricks by sight. He could tell from the color of the clay whether it had been fired too long. Could tell from the sound of 2 bricks tapped together whether they would settle well in a wall. He marked each pallet with a slash of chalk. 1 slash meant ready. 2 slashes meant weak. 3 slashes meant flawed, but useful for the inner parts. No one would see, and he did this for 6 years, never missing a count. Asterisk. Every evening, he would kneel beside the brick piles, hand-stained, lips moving silently not in prayer, but in calculation. He recited numbers the way others recited verses. 12 rows, 14 across, 60 deep. He believed numbers had a weight of their own, that if you stacked them wrong, even beauty would collapse. His son, a boy named Tufail, worked beside him. Tufail was not a counter. He was a listener. He noticed how the bricklayers hummed when the bricks aligned well, held when pressure was even, how the joints looked when water content in the lime was off by a single ladle. Together, father and son created a system that allowed brick to rise like breath, not hurried, not broken, but deliberate. By year 4, the bricks were rising faster than the masons could polish marble, and so strange pause settled over the site. The platform was done, but the monument had not yet begun. Rahmet Ali stood atop the vast brick rectangle and smiled. He said, "She's waiting." And she was. The Taj, though not yet built, was implied in every brick laid, in every well filled, in every corner that had not yet been touched, but had already been remembered by someone's footstep. There is a story that in the 5th year, a minor earthquake struck just north of Agra. Not strong, but enough to rattle carts, crack wells, topple a grain silo the emperor sent for an inspector. The inspector came, tapped the platform with his cane, listened, looked at the corners, checked for settling, found nothing. No movement, no shift. The platform had held not just from engineering, but from the thousands of moments no one had watched the checks, the taps, the whispered arguments over whether a brick was ready or not. That night, Rahmet Ali didn't sleep. He walked the edge of the platform alone, ran his fingers along the uppermost row of bricks, stopped at the center, sat down, closed his eyes, and said, "For the first and only time, she'll stay." He died 2 months later, not in the site, not in ceremony, just quietly under the neem tree near the kill. His son continued the work, but he never laid another brick. He only listened, made sure the silence inside the foundation matched the silence the Taj would one day carry on its skin. Even now, engineers who studied the platform are confused. How could such a structure hold for centuries in flood-prone, shifting ground? Some speak of ratios, some of secret additives in the mortar, but none mentioned the men who counted without notebooks, the boys who listened to lime, the quiet rows of bricks no one ever painted, polished, or praised, and yet they are still there, buried, holding the monument, not with pride, but with consistency, the kind that never gets attention, but without which nothing tall ever stands. Asterisk, it's easy to forget, when looking at the Taj Mahal now, that it doesn't stand on marble alone. It stands on earth, the most unpredictable material of all. In earth, no matter how much it's measured, tapped, or shaped, always has its own memory. But the builders of the Taj didn't try to erase that memory. They tried to hold space for it. Once the wells were filled, and once the bricks were laid, a quiet phase began. The phase that no inscription mentions, that no poet wrote about, but which shaped the very balance of the monument. The settling. For 6 months, the platform was left untouched. No scaffolds were raised. No marble was hauled. A carving was begun. Just silence, because the engineers understood what many others didn't. The earth must be allowed to breathe again after being asked to carry so much. The wells had changed it. The bricks had pressed it. And now it needed to settle into its new identity, no longer to soil, but support. The emperor didn't question the pause. He trusted his architects, but others grew impatient. Courtiers murmured about delays. Artisans left to take on other projects. The lime crews were temporarily dismissed, and in the heart of it all, the red platform sat beneath the sun, cracked, not at all, shifting, not even once, just waiting. It was during this pause that an old gardener named Samshir made a habit of walking the edges of the platform at dawn. He wasn't assigned, he wasn't asked, but he had worked on the first phase of the gardens, the ones that would later flank the Taj. Hey, he wanted to see if the platform would speak. He claimed it did. He said that when the wind came from the south, he air-held. No dust. He could hear the platform hum beneath his feet, like a drum that had been perfectly tuned, but not yet played. One morning, during one of his walks, he paused and sat near the northern edge, not to rest, to listen. The earth was very still. Still in a way that felt final, not tired, not dormant. Ready. That same day, a pair of engineers returned to test the compression of the foundation. They used metal stakes and small hammers, tapping slowly, listening. 4 hollow points. They found none. Even the outer corners closest to the river had held. No signs of expansion. No buckling. No seepage. The wells had done their work. The bricks had kept their pact. And the earth, beneath all of it, had agreed to carry the monument. That was when the marble began. Piece by piece, slab by slab. But something subtle happened in the years that followed. The wells were forgotten, not erased maliciously, just quietly bypassed. Once the marble began to gleam, people no longer looked down. Once the arches began to rise, the platform was treated as a stage knot, as the body of the structure. The workers who had dug the wells weren't called back. The brick counters weren't mentioned in court. Their work had succeeded so fully, it disappeared. And perhaps that was the highest praise, because the goal was never glory. The goal was stillness, stillness that held weight, stillness that did not need reminding. Today, if you stand on the central plinth and press your palm to the marble, you won't feel the wells, you won't hear the bricks, but you'll feel something else, a resistance that is not rigid, but patient, a weight that is not heavy, but resolved, like standing on the back of something that once sighed, and then made peace with the burden. Engineers who restored the monument today rely on tools, ultrasound, seismic scans, thermal sensors, where the ground tells them the same thing it told them. Builders 4 centuries ago. I'm holding. Don't rush me, okay? And don't forget I'm here. And in the rare, still moments when the crowds have gone and the sun is just beginning to climb, if you sit quietly at the edge of the red sandstone platform, you may feel the faintest pulse in the soles of your feet. Not a vibration, not movement, just breath rising through stone, through brick, through lime, through the forgotten wells beneath your heels. And you'll know, without needing proof, that you are not standing on architecture alone. You are standing on a memory of earth, a memory that was shaped by hands, filled with silence, and left behind by men who never expected things, just a promise that the sky above would never fall. Asterisk.